The days blurred into one endless hum. The hum of the Liberty ship's engines, the hum of blood in one's ears, the hum of hundreds of female voices trapped in the vessel's steel belly, sometimes fading to a whisper, sometimes breaking into hysterical laughter. Ingrid von Hagen sat in her corner, clutching the only thing she had left of her former life, a small photograph of her husband in his formal black SS uniform. She did not cry. Tears were an unaffordable luxury, a display of weakness unworthy of an officer's widow. Instead, she honed her hatred. She fashioned it into a sharp, cold stiletto, which she kept hidden deep inside. This stiletto was her only weapon against what awaited them. They were sailing to America, to the New World, which seemed to her a vulgar, noisy fairground populated by people with no roots and no honor. The propaganda had painted Americans as degenerate plutocrats and jazz-crazed Negroes. But Ingrid, having received an excellent education, knew the reality was more frightening. The enemy was not primitive, he was cunning, and his revenge would be just as cunning. She looked at the faces of the other women in the dim light of a single bulb. Marta Bauer, the young signals operator with the burning eyes of a fanatic, was whispering something passionate to her neighbors, surely about duty and fortitude. Else Richter, pragmatic to the core, was trying to strike up a conversation with a guard, offering a silver cigarette case in exchange for a smoke. It was useless. The guards were deaf and mute. They were a function. "They'll send us to Louisiana," hissed one of the women whose face Ingrid couldn't make out in the gloom. "There are swamps there, malaria, and they'll make us work on the plantations, with the Negroes. My brother wrote from Africa that they do that to their prisoners." This thought was the most terrifying. Not hunger, not beatings, but precisely the ritualistic defilement, the forced mixing with those their ideology called inferior races. It would be a blow not to the body, but to the very soul, to the blood, to the essence of their race, for the purity of which her husband, Kurt, had fought and died. Ingrid remembered his face, strong-willed, aristocratic, as if carved from marble. He had died in December of '44 during the Ardennes offensive, the last desperate attempt to turn the tide of the war. He had left with a smile, saying, "We are building a 1,000-year Reich, my love. Even if we die, the idea will live on." Now she, his widow, was sailing into captivity at the hands of those who had destroyed their dream. And she was preparing to pay for that dream. She was preparing for interrogations. She, a nurse from the elite SS sanatorium Hohenlychen, where the highest ranks of the Reich were treated, might know something of interest to American intelligence. She mentally rehearsed her answers, building walls of lies and silence in her mind. She prepared for medical experiments, for the victors would surely want to study exemplary Aryan women like lab animals. She prepared for everything. Her preparation was cold and methodical. She was a daughter of her class, of her nation. She would not break. She would become a silent reproach to them, a symbol of their Pyrrhic victory. Sometimes they were brought out onto the deck. The sun was blinding, the salt wind whipping their hair. The American soldiers returning home would watch them. In their gazes there was curiosity, sometimes lust, but most often just indifference. To them, they were trophies, strange souvenirs of a cursed European war they had won and wanted to forget as quickly as possible. This indifference was more insulting than hatred. Hatred would have meant an acknowledgement of their strength, their significance. Indifference turned them into inanimate cargo. On the 14th day of the voyage, the hum of the engines changed. The ship slowed its pace. A long, drawn-out horn sounded, its echo reverberating through the hold and in the hearts of hundreds of women. A silence fell. Heavy, viscous, like silt at the bottom of the ocean. The door slid open with a screech, letting in a strip of gray, damp light. The silhouette of an officer in the doorway, a short command in a foreign tongue. "It's time." Ingrid rose slowly. She smoothed her hair, straightened the folds of her worn but still well-cut uniform. For the last time, she touched the cold metal frame of Kurt's photograph, hidden on her chest. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the stale air of their floating sarcophagus. She was ready. She stepped toward the light, toward her Golgotha. The port of Norfolk, Virginia, met them not with the roar of a crowd, but with businesslike bustle and the smell of creosote from railroad ties. Everything was frighteningly organized. A corridor of silent military police, covered trucks, short, emotionless commands. Ingrid searched the faces of the Americans for hatred, but saw only fatigue and professional indifference. They were loaded into the backs of the trucks and driven away. They drove for a long time, through monotonous landscapes of pine forests and sparse farms, a peaceful, sleepy world untouched by war. The sight caused a dull ache. Somewhere back there in the ruins of Berlin, her mother was trying to survive while here, magnolias bloomed and children rode bicycles. Finally, the trucks turned off the highway and stopped at a gate topped with barbed wire. "Camp Fort Patrick," the sign read. Beyond the gate, rows of identical black, tar paper-covered barracks were visible. It was exactly as she had imagined it, grim, utilitarian, soulless. They were led out, lined up on the parade ground. The commandant, a Colonel Mortimer, was an elderly, stooped man with a face etched with wrinkles and sad eyes. He didn't make a long speech. "You are prisoners of war. Your rights are protected by the Geneva Convention. Your duties are to obey orders. You will now be taken for disinfection and placed in the barracks. Welcome to Virginia." His voice was as dry as an autumn leaf. A clear irony rang in his last sentence. The intake procedure was swift and humiliating in its banality. Showers, delousing, and the issuance of standard camp attire, coarse cotton dresses of a drab gray color. All of Ingrid's personal belongings were taken, including Kurt's photograph. When she tried to object, the officer simply looked at her with empty eyes and tossed the photo into a common box. "It's an order." In that moment, the cold fury inside her almost broke through, but she restrained herself. The stiletto of hatred had to be saved for the decisive moment. Their barrack turned out to be a long, dark room with 2 rows of bunk beds. But something was strange. Through the thin walls, sounds could be heard. German speech, yes, but not only that. There was laughter, the crying of children, snippets of conversation in an unfamiliar guttural language. "What is that?" Marta asked, listening intently. The answer came the next morning. After a meager breakfast, they were taken out to work. Not to build roads, not to chop wood. They were brought to a vast field divided into neat plots. Potatoes, cabbage, beans, a common vegetable garden. And there they saw them. On the other half of the field, separated only by a symbolic line, other people were working. Men, women, the elderly, and children. People with slanted eyes and sallow skin. Japanese. They were dressed in the same simple work clothes, their movements slow and weary. They silently weeded the beds, occasionally exchanging quiet phrases in their own language. Ingrid froze. Her brain refused to process what she was seeing. Japanese, their Axis allies. What were they doing here? "Look," exclaimed Marta with a kind of wicked delight. "They brought them here too. Now we are together, in the same boat." But these were not prisoners of war. Ingrid noticed that among them were old men and very young children. They did not look like soldiers. One of the guards, an old sergeant with a bloated face, noticed their confusion and smirked. "What, Fräulein, surprised? These aren't POWs. They're ours. Americans. From California. It's just that their grandfathers were born in the wrong place. The meaning began to slowly dawn on Ingrid. These people were citizens of the United States, internees, locked in a camp simply because of their ancestry. And then she saw the second line of fencing. Their camp, the camp for German POWs, was only one half of a huge complex. The other half, separated by another barbed wire fence, was the camp for these people. Two camps, side by side. Two kinds of prisoners, forced to cultivate this damned garden together under the same Virginia sky. This was not what she had expected. Not at all. This was not humiliation through mixing with inferior races. This was something far more complex and monstrous in its symmetry. The Americans were not just punishing them, they were holding up a mirror to them. But what was reflected in it was not their own cruelty, but the cruelty of their victors. They were not saying, "Look what monsters you are." They were silently demonstrating, "Look, we are no better." Ingrid looked at an elderly Japanese woman who was struggling to straighten her back, and at a young man who was placing weeds into a basket with quiet dignity. Their faces were impassive, but deep in their eyes lay the same pain and bewilderment that she herself felt. Her ideology, her worldview built on superiority, suffered its first deep crack. She had prepared to be a martyr at the hands of barbarians. But how could one be a martyr at the hands of those who forced you to look upon other martyrs of their own making? This realization brought no gloating. It brought only an icy, paralyzing shock. Her entire inner stiletto of hatred suddenly seemed absurd and childish. Against such an enemy, it was useless. The days began to flow in a strange, surreal rhythm. Every morning they were led out to the vegetable garden. The work was monotonous, exhausting. But the physical fatigue was nothing compared to the moral exhaustion. The German women and the Japanese Americans worked on adjacent plots, separated by an invisible wall of silence and mistrust. Martha Bauer tried to organize sabotage. She urged them to work slower, to damage the tools, to refuse any interaction with the yellows. "We are Aryans. They are a different race. Even here in the dirt, we must remember who we are," she would hiss in the barracks at night. But her calls found less and less support. Most of the women were too exhausted and depressed to play these games. Else Richter, on the contrary, quickly found common ground with one of the Japanese women. They didn't speak the same language, but through gestures and broken English words they established a primitive barter system. Else would trade an extra piece of bread for a homemade needle or thread that the Japanese women somehow managed to acquire. "The survivor is the one who trades, not the one who fights," she would state cynically. Ingrid, for her part, chose a tactic of icy detachment. She worked silently, focused, without raising her eyes. She ignored the Japanese, ignored her own countrywomen, ignored the guards. She created a vacuum around herself, trying to preserve the remnants of her shattered world. But the vacuum could not be absolute. She constantly felt someone's gaze on her. It was that same young Japanese man. He often worked on the adjacent plot. He had fine, intelligent features and the hands of an artist. He never tried to speak to her, but she saw in his gaze not hostility or pity, but a calm, profound curiosity. One day during the midday break, as everyone sat in the shade of a few sparse trees, he approached her. In his hands, he held a piece of wrapping paper and a piece of charcoal, which he had apparently found in a cold fire pit. Without a word, he handed her the paper. On it was a drawing, a portrait of one of the older German women, Clara Weiss, who had lost her entire family in Dresden and now spent most of her time staring blankly into space. The drawing was done with quick but confident strokes. The charcoal had captured not just the facial features, but the entire abyss of sorrow in her eyes. It was not just a sketch. It was a work of art, full of compassion. Ingrid looked at the drawing, then at him. "Why?" she asked in German, not expecting the words to come out. "Because she is sad," he replied in surprisingly clear English. Then he added, slowly, choosing his words in broken German, which he had obviously studied in college. "Trauer hat keine Nationalität." Sorrow has no nationality. Ingrid was stunned, not just by his knowledge of German, but by the phrase itself. She, the widow of an SS officer who had fervently believed in the hierarchy of nations and races, heard a simple, undeniable truth from a member of an inferior race, locked in a camp by her enemies. "My name is Kenji," he said. "Kenji Tanaka. I'm from Los Angeles." She did not reply. She simply took the drawing and returned to her barrack. All evening she stared at this image of grief, made by the hand of her enemy's enemy, and she felt the icy walls she had built around herself begin to melt under the pressure of this simple human gesture. Their communication became a strange ritual. They rarely spoke. Sometimes he would show her his new drawings, portraits of weary faces, landscapes with barbed wire, still lifes of camp food. Sometimes she, overcoming her pride, would ask a question in English, and he would answer. She learned that he had been an art history student, studying European art. He spoke with enthusiasm about Dürer and Caspar David Friedrich. He knew more about German culture than many of her own countrywomen. "How can this be?" she asked one day. "You are an American. You studied our culture, and they did this to you." Kenji looked at his hands, stained with earth. "War is a disease. It infects everyone, and it makes people afraid. They are afraid of us because we look like the ones who bombed Pearl Harbor. They are afraid of you because—" He didn't finish, but Ingrid understood. This conversation was a turning point for her. For the first time, she looked at the situation not from her own perspective, not from the perspective of a defeated German woman. She looked at it through Kenji's eyes, and she saw a universal tragedy in which ideology was merely an excuse for fear. Her own ideology of superiority and racial purity now seemed not just wrong, but pathetic and naive in the face of this complex, multifaceted truth. One evening, after a particularly hard day, she found a new drawing on her bunk. It wasn't a portrait. It was a sketch of a flower that had pushed its way through a crack in the asphalt of the parade ground. Underneath the drawing was a single word, written in German, Trotzdem. Nevertheless. Ingrid sat on her bunk, pressed the drawing to her chest, and for the first time in many months, for the first time since hearing of Kurt's death, she cried. These were not tears of self-pity or hatred. They were bitter, cleansing tears for a collapsed world, for her own blindness, for the universal human tragedy she had witnessed and participated in, here in this strange camp in Virginia. The news spread through the camp like wildfire. The Americans were going to show them a film. This news sparked a wave of rumors. "It will be propaganda," Martha Bauer declared confidently. "They'll show us a burning Berlin and make us watch." "Or a newsreel of their victories," another woman added, "to humiliate us even more." Ingrid remained silent. After her conversations with Kenji, she no longer expected primitive humiliations. She expected something more complex, more subtle, something that would once again strike at her fragile, new worldview. On the appointed evening, they were all gathered in the large barrack that served as a dining hall. A sheet was hung in the middle, and a projector was set up in the corner. Colonel Mortimer was also present, standing silently against the wall with his arms crossed. His face was, as always, impenetrable. The lights went out. The projector began to whir. Images appeared on the screen. But it was not Berlin, and it was not a victory parade. It was American cities, San Francisco, Los Angeles, streets full of people with Asian features, shops with Japanese characters, children playing baseball, farmers working in their fields. The scene changed. December 1941. Newspaper headlines about Pearl Harbor, the hate-contorted faces of white Americans. Posters, Jap hunting licenses sold here. Kick the Japs out. And then came the footage shot by the government. Long lines of people with suitcases. Soldiers with rifles escorting families to trains. Numbers pinned to their clothes. And finally, the camps in the desert. Barracks, barbed wire, dust storms, and faces. The faces of people who had lost everything. Their homes, their businesses, their freedom, their dignity. The faces Ingrid saw every day in the vegetable garden. Kenji's face, so young, looking at the camera in confusion. The face of the elderly woman he had drawn. A narrator's voice, level and almost indifferent, read excerpts from Executive Order 9066, signed by President Roosevelt. It spoke of military necessity, of protection against espionage and sabotage. Not a single charge, not a single piece of evidence, just race, just fear. A dead silence hung in the barrack. The German women watched the screen, a storm of emotions on their faces. Disbelief, bewilderment, and recognition. They were not watching a foreign tragedy. They were seeing in it a distorted but unmistakable reflection of their own system. The same methods, the same rhetoric, the same cold, bureaucratic cruelty, cloaked in the language of national security. Ingrid sat gripping the bench. Her mind was racing. Her entire life, her entire faith had been built on an opposition. Us and them. The noble Aryans and the barbaric, chaotic world around them. We are the bearers of order. They are the bearers of chaos. We are the builders. They are the destroyers. But this film, shown to them by their enemies, demolished that opposition at its foundation. It didn't excuse them, no. It accused them, but not directly. It accused them by showing that the very same disease, the disease of fear, of hatred for the other, the willingness to sacrifice a human being for an abstract security, lived in the hearts of their conquerors as well. It was the ultimate form of psychological torture. Instead of branding them as unique monsters, they were shown that their monstrosity was just one manifestation of a universal human sickness. It stripped them of their exceptionalism, even in their sin. When the lights came on, no one moved. The silence was broken by a quiet sob. It was Clara Weiss, the woman from Kenji's drawing. She looked at the empty screen and shook her head. "They are the same," she whispered. "They are the same as us." Ingrid felt nausea rise in her throat. She stood up and stumbled toward the exit. She couldn't see where she was going. She needed air. At the doorway she saw Colonel Mortimer. He was looking directly at her. In his sad eyes, for the first time, she saw not only fatigue, but also a deep, personal pain. The pain of a man who had lost his son in a war against one nation and was forced to guard innocent people from another. "Do you understand now, Fräulein?" he asked quietly. Ingrid couldn't answer. She ran out of the barrack and stopped, gasping for breath. The sky was full of stars, the same stars as over Germany. She looked at the 2 rows of barracks, hers and the Japanese one. 2 pens for human beings, separated by wire and ideologies, but united by a common sorrow. In that moment, her world turned completely upside down. She realized that her husband Kurt, her hero, had not died for a great idea. He had died for one version of the very disease that had locked Kenji Tanaka behind barbed wire. And that thought was more terrifying than any verdict, more terrible than any torture. It was the truth, naked and merciless, and there was nowhere to run from it. After that evening, A stupor descended upon the camp. The work in the garden continued, but now there was something different about it. The silence between the Germans and the Japanese had changed. Before, it had been a silence of mistrust and alienation. Now, it was a silence of a shared, unspoken understanding. The women sometimes exchanged brief, sympathetic glances. Clara Weiss once shared her piece of bread with the elderly Japanese woman, who in return bowed to her, pressing her hands to her chest. They were small, barely perceptible gestures, but they signified a tectonic shift. Only Marta Bauer did not give up. She became even more vehement in her denial. "It's all a trick," she would shout in the barrack. "They're showing us this to make us feel guilty, to break our spirit. Don't give in." But no one listened to her anymore. Her fanaticism seemed pathetic and out of place in this new context. Ingrid no longer sought solitude. She sought out Kenji. She would find him in the garden, and they would talk. She told him about her life in Germany, about her husband, about her faith. She spoke not to justify herself, but to understand. He listened attentively, without interrupting, and there was no judgment in his eyes. "I believed," she said one day, looking at the barbed wire that separated their camp from the rest of the world. "I truly believed that we were bringing order to the world, that we were a better, a higher form of civilization, and everyone else, they were chaos. Now I see that our order was built on the same fear and injustice as your camp." "Order built on fear is not order," Kenji replied softly. "It's just a more organized prison. My professor in college, a Jew who fled Vienna in '38, used to say that the main battle in history is not between nations or races, but between those who build bridges and those who build walls." She looked at him. At this young man who had lost everything, but had not lost his ability to think, to feel, and to create. Who, while sitting in a camp, would recite Rilke's poems to her from memory and talk about perspective and Dürer's engravings. "What will you do when this is all over?" she asked. Kenji shrugged. "My home is gone. My parents' farm was sold for a pittance. I don't know. Maybe I'll try to go back to university. Maybe I'll go to Europe to see the ruins. An artist must see not only the beauty but also the scars of the world." He looked at her. "And you?" This simple question caught her off guard. She had never thought about the future. Her future had died with Kurt and collapsed with the Reich. I don't know," she answered honestly. "I am a nurse. Maybe I can help people. Not German people, not American people. Just people. If they let me." During their last meeting, the day before the first group of German women was to be sent to another camp for eventual repatriation, Kenji brought her a farewell gift. It wasn't a drawing. It was a small bird carved from wood, clumsy, made with a simple pocket knife, but full of life. "It doesn't fly very well," he said with a sad smile, "but it remembers the sky." Ingrid took the bird. The smooth, warm wood rested in her palm. She looked through the wire at his face, at the barracks behind him, at the other Japanese who were silently watching them, and she realized she was leaving this prison a completely different person. The Americans had not broken her. They had not humiliated her. They had done something far more important. They had shown her that the world was not divided into black and white, into us and them. It was composed of infinite shades of gray, and within every human being, regardless of race or nationality, lived the capacity for both great cruelty and great compassion. And the choice was always yours. The wooden bird in her hand was not just a gift. It was a symbol of a fragile, wounded soul that, despite everything, still remembered the sky.